Have you ever wondered why painters often start their painting process on a brightly primed surface, especially if they're just gonna paint over it? In today's video, I'm gonna give you 5 reasons why painters start out on various colored surfaces, as well as show you the reason. I did this one time before on a short form video where I made a painting on a glass panel and then I swapped it out with all of the common colors that artists often paint on. So a historical color is this burnt sienna. A lot of contemporary painters will start on this neon red or a fuchsia or even a lime green. And why I, in school, started out on a gray surface. In this video, I'm basically going to go over 5 distinct reasons with explanation and visuals. And at the end of the video, I'm going to show you the process to making this little seascape as I talk to you about sort of the larger philosophy as to why painters really do anything, especially if it's something that's going to be covered up. All this to say, there's a lot of different reasons why painters might choose a multitude of different colors to start their paintings on. The first reason has to do with value. Value is basically how light or how dark a color is, and specific to painters who are painting representationally. I know that once we veer into abstraction, the rules are a little bit looser. I paint largely representationally. I teach largely representationally. So with that in mind, that's going to be what I'm speaking to. But value is one of the most important ways to make something look realistic. A lot of times artists starting out put a lot of emphasis on the drawing, but if you've ever painted, let's say a face, for example, and you know with certainty that your features are in the right place, maybe you traced or used a projector and it still looks really cartoonish, it is almost certainly that you have not understood and translated with your paints your value. That is to say that if you are formally trained or you take classes or you're really wanting to improve your skill, a lot of times you're gonna have to spend energy and time and intentionality making sure that your values are accurate or at least relatively accurate. And one of the best ways you can do that right from the jump, the very beginning of your painting, is by paying attention to the value that you start off with. This is why in college, when I was learning to paint, my professor had us start out with a gray surface. You could also have a very neutral brown. Grays tend to just be somewhere between achromatic and cooler typically, but very, very muted. I've also seen people start with a raw umber, which is a very neutral brown. In fact, I did this little painting on masonite board, which is a kind of a raw umber neutral brown anyways. And because the value is right in the middle of the value scale, you're able to work both forwards and backwards in color. What that literally means is that when you start on stark white, every single color you lay down, even if it is a very light color, is going to be darker. And it's difficult and challenging for our eye to see and understand value when we have such a bright value pushing against us. It both makes it harder to actually see and understand value because our eye's exposure is quite literally blown out. I think one thing to remember as a painter is that our eye is just like a camera lens. It contracts and retracts in order to let in light. And when you have something very bright you're looking at, it can actually subtly augment the way you are seeing your values. And also, it's hard to push just in one direction. When you start with a middle value, you can work a little bit backwards, that is to say slightly darker and then slightly lighter. And then as your painting develops, you can push either into the value scale. Approaching value with that more measured approach is a way to guarantee that you'll have a better handle of your values in the beginning of your painting process. Likewise, if you're doing something like a nocturne or a painting that is very dark, let's say you're trying to create the illusion of light, one of the ways to do that is to make sure that the vast majority of your composition is in the darker values. It can be helpful to start on a dark surface. I did a nocturne series many years ago, and one of the most helpful things I did was I primed my surface with a Payne's gray, which is basically like a dark gray and ultramarine blue mixed color. And to this day, if I am starting to do a nocturne, I will usually prime with either a black or a near black and let that push towards the darker values help me to guide myself through painting the darker values. As I'm showing you this, I also want to point out there are spots in my beach painting where you can see through the composition be sure to look at those holes because they inform the entire painting. That is to say, often the paints themselves aren't fully opaque, which means that if you're applying a transparent color like alizarin or even a more opaque color, you just have put it on looser, you've dry brushed or you've scumbled or you've just added a lot of medium to your paint. This goes for acrylic as well as oil and gouache. Then you're going to be able to see the underpainting through the finished product. Now, some people's style and approach is that they're going to cover their painting multiple times over, but generally speaking, you're going to see some of that poke through your composition. So as I'm switching out the background colors, make a note at the spots in the canvas where the paint is either translucent or there's actually holes, and see how that informs the overall composition. All right, reason number 2, and that is what I like to call white surface syndrome. And that is, a lot of times painters, especially painters who struggle with perfectionism, a lot of us do in the very beginning, really can struggle to put down our first few marks on our canvas. And I find this even more so if you are starting with a graphite drawing and then going in. It can turn into a sort of paint by numbers coloring book situation really fast, and it can add to a lot of anxiety. It is for both of these reasons that I will often have students push for any color. You can be really methodical, as I will show you in the rest of this video. There are very intentional reasons why someone might have a very specific color or value. But if all of that is irrelevant to you, you just want to get going, I would say just to put any color down, because starting on white, again, the value thing, of course, but also it can just be kind of stressful to put a first mark on here. And what if it's in the wrong spot? What if you regret it? Then you smudge it. And it shouldn't matter, it doesn't matter, but if you know that perfectionism is something that you carry with you and that putting down an ugly color or the wrong color is going to stress you out, then simply do not start on a white surface. You can use leftover paints from other sessions and kind of scrub it in. Whatever you want to do, you don't have to go above and beyond, but starting on white can be tricky for that reason. And then also a little bit of a nod to the last point. Anytime you have a stark white, the white that is of the surface poking through the finished painting, it's always going to read as highlight. Anything that falls very extreme, so very intense colors, very light, very dark, is always going to grab the eye. Again, that's why we tend to start on a middle tone, because if you don't finish the whole painting and some of that middle tone pops through, it's not going to jump out and be really visual and grab the viewer's attention. So it's just another kind of insurance. The next thing is pulling the color temperature or informing the color of a composition. So similar to how value can often be informed by that initial color, I find that the chroma, which is another way of saying sort of the colory quality of paint, things like the warmth and the coolness of the painting, can be very directly informed by your underpainting. So one of the most sort of historical underpaintings is to start with a burnt sienna wash. This is in part because a lot of these earth tones dry really quickly, and the utility of that is great, especially if you're painting something like a plein air painting. Obviously with acrylics, it's less of an issue, but I will say I do like to prime my surface when I'm doing plein air paintings, aka painting out in nature, with this burnt sienna color. And that's because greens tend to get really plasticky really fast. And one thing that starting on a burnt sienna, raw sienna color can do is where the green sort of thins out, whether your paint thins out or you don't fully cover, these little pops of warmth in your green can really keep it from looking like one green mass, which is the biggest problem when it comes to green. I will say I have a video of how to paint greens. If that is a problem for you, then I will definitely link that video and you should definitely check it out. But that is to say, this is kind of a hack. Instead of mixing your greens and making a note to mix in lots of yellows and oranges to keep it in that natural color mixing area, by simply having your substrate or your surface with this orange color on it, you add that variety without having to work on it. And finally, to drive this point home, whether you do a different kind of red, this is something called muted pink. I like to start a lot of portraits on this color because, again, whenever you have the thinner parts of the paint or more translucent colors, this to me is a great color for specifically warm shadows. So when you're doing portraits, a lot of times your shadows actually pull a little bit on the warm side. A lot of that is because there is blood under your skin, and skin tends to be warm in color across the color spectrum. And having that warm reflect warm, you do often get shadows that have a lot of this color in it. So it just adds some depth without having to mix those subtle colors and really go above and beyond. It's just kind of an easy hack, if you will, or a little thing you can do in the beginning that sort of serves you throughout the entirety of your painting. The last thing I'll say about warming and cooling is that one way to sort of add that painterly quality to your compositions is having that back and forth between a warm and a cool color. In this oceanscape painting, anytime I use a really warm underpainting or have a warm surface underneath it, you'll see that it breaks up both the water and the sand. In both of these cases, the water is a little bit cool, it's blue, so obviously it's cool, and then the sand is kind of a true neutral. And by having that warmth underneath it, you can see that there's a bit of variation, a little bit of back and forth, where the seemingly one color surface has that slight undulation of warm and cool. And that is always going to be a very interesting, a little bit more on the sophisticated side, color flourish that you can add as a painter. If your paintings turn out really graphic, that is to say that it's all one solid color and that's not what you're going for, because again, stylistically you can do whatever you want with paintings, but if you keep ending up in this graphic cartoony territory and you're not wanting that, by letting your underpainting sort of peek through, it can really break up what would otherwise be a really solid form. And of course this goes for any of the other warm colors. Conversely, of course, the opposite is true, vice versa. If you have something that's very, very warm, by putting a purple or maybe a muted blue underneath it, you can add a little bit of coolness that again just breaks up that solid mass, whether you're wanting to undulate warm and cool or break up the value or just simply add another color into the mix. Our fourth reason is a technical reason, and this really depends on the surface quality that you're painting on, aka is it paper? Is it a sort of plastic that a lot of people will paint on? Is it a panel? Is it a canvas, right? All of your surfaces are going to behave really differently. I painted on glass. It is the antithesis of a thirsty surface. I don't mind that. I tend to paint on really smooth surfaces, but I used to paint on canvases. I used to paint on a lot of budget canvases, which is important to this point because they tend to be really thirsty. I don't know if it's because there's not very many layers of gesso or if the gesso itself is more porous. I'm not 100% sure. But whenever I was a new painter, I would often do kind of a thicker coat of acrylic paint underneath it. Yes, to bump down my value because I learned to do that in art school, but I also found that when I was putting on my colors, it didn't soak up as much of my colors. I was able to glide and smooth and push the paint further. So for me personally, my trick was to take my cheapest paints, my kind of leftover paints. Weirdly enough, I always had orange left over. I think it's because I tend to mix my own oranges and purples even still to this day for the most part. And I had a lot of orange left over and I started painting all of my surfaces on orange, which is when I started many moons ago to get all of these questions about how do you choose what color to paint on. And I remember at the time being like, well, it's not good to start on white. And also I just have a ton of orange left over. And it's because I wanted to fill in my cheaper canvases with that plasticky acrylic, and that once it cures and fully dries, it resists paints. So my more expensive paints and the paints that I wanted to use chromatically for my painting would go further. I've also done this and seen this a lot with gouache paintings on paper even, that especially if you're using something like a traditional gouache, you want to hydrate your paper a little bit. So again, gouache can be kind of dry. It can kind of scumble and dry brush in a way that isn't great. So a lot of times what people do, especially if it's plein air and you're contending with wind and sun, is they will use a wash of, again, insert whatever color to bump down the value and to sort of hydrate the paper as they work on their painting. And finally, on that note, this is more of a tip, but I am such a big fan of the Liquitex clear gesso. It has almost a like sandpapery tooth to it, so it gives it texture. And one thing that I've been known to do is mix up a cup with a little bit of, again, insert whatever color, hot pink, whatever, into 2/3, so a 1/3 to 2/3 ratio of the clear gesso, and it gives my surface a little bit of a wash. And if I'm painting on a surface that's too slick, it's really hard. I remember one time, for example, they had a bunch of the Da Vinci ultra smooth panels on sale. I usually paint on the ones with a little more tooth, whatever, it doesn't matter. But I ended up getting those and then priming them with that pink color, but also mixed in with that gesso. So it was a 2-in-1. It primed the physical surface to be a little grittier, which I prefer. And then it added some pink to it, so I was not painting on a white surface. And the final reason is tiptoeing into that formal underpainting territory. And that is to say that sometimes you can choose colors and place multiple colors on your underpainting to activate and help inform the formal painting. That is to say, what's the difference between an underpainting and the official painting? It's nebulous. It depends on the artist. Some people will do incredibly detailed grisaille sketches where they'll take Van Dyke brown and some kind of a white and they'll render something very, very accurately. Think of like a Caravaggio. People also do this with terre verte, so that green for portraiture. Again, it's kind of back to that. If you have some translucency in your warm, pinky, orangey, brown flesh tones, that green that comes through can neutralize it and make it look realistic. It's just a style, it's just a technique. But by thinking about your composition, so let's say you're doing a landscape, your sky is really blue, your landscape, let's say it's a field of orange and yellow poppies, so it's really warm. You might map out the top of the painting to be a color that's going to contrast with the sky. In this case, let's say it's a nice pinky orange, and then you have almost a green color underneath the poppies. And by having the opposite color of the dominant color underneath, you're able to create kind of this simultaneous contrast effect. An artist who does this really well is Erin Hansen. She will sort of map out her paintings with the opposite color. There's a thing that happens in the viewer's eye where if you see the opposite color next to your dominant color, so blue sky but with little pops of orange, we see the blue as more intense because it's activating opposite cones. It's a little bit of color science, but if vibrancy is something that you're going for, that can certainly be a really helpful technique. Similarly, I'm sure you've seen people do what's called a rub out, or it's also called a bistre layer, and that's where someone will take a layer of burnt sienna or raw sienna or a warm color usually, and before it is completely dry, they will take a rag or a Q-tip and they will rub out so that they're left with a lighter value, and this kind of creates a value map. It's sort of the same idea as starting with gray so that your values are easier to analyze, but taking it one step further and creating sort of a distinct map of this is the light sky, this is the dark trees, and this is the middle tone water, something like that. I can make a separate video on underpainting because truly there's a lot more to explore there. And since this is really about sort of the under color, I'm going to leave it at that, but know that there is more there. And that's generally the reasons why people pick the colors they do. Sometimes it's very thought out and methodical, and they will analyze their composition with their underpainting. And in other cases, it's just this will quench a thirsty canvas. It's no longer white, and I like looking at lime green. That is, for me anyways, a lot of times the only thinking that goes into it. But if you want to hear a little bit of sort of my philosophy around painting and why it's important that your process has more to do with the artist and the viewer, then stay tuned for just a moment. Otherwise, that's my video. That's the reasons. If you like information like this, check out my online art school, Not Sari Art School, where you can learn to paint. I have a free 7-day bootcamp so you can see if e-learning is right for you. It's not for everybody. I also teach in-person workshops and retreats. Please check the place to check for all of those links, or just message me and say, hey, you said something about a retreat, give me information, and I will be sure to get back to you. Also, it helps the channel if you like, comment, and of course, subscribe if you want to see more art educational videos, everything from teaching technique all the way up to sort of my thoughts on the contemporary art world. But finally, back to the sort of what I call the importance of taking the scenic route as an artist. A lot of times, because nowadays you're able to share your process online via a time lapse or something similar, lay people who maybe don't have a creative practice, or at least not a painting practice, will often ask questions about the utility of a step. So for example, per this video, if you're just going to cover everything up, and sometimes people will do really ornate underpaintings and they do cover it up completely, then why would you go through the effort or waste the paint if you're just going to cover it up? And I think that's one of the reasons I'm passionate that everyone should have a creative practice. Not because I think everyone's necessarily going to become the most successful, prolific artist ever and it's going to be their thing. I think it's just like part of being a human to have a creative practice, whether you choose to sell it or not, generally speaking. But also, I think it's really important for all of us to know that when it comes to anything creative, whether it's formally creative, like a painting, or lowercase c creative like cooking dinner or planning out your household, it's important to remember that part of that process should really cater to what you want and what you feel like. That is to say, your own inspiration and motivation is actually oftentimes prioritized over the finished product. When I started on social media about 10 years ago, there was a big push for something called process over the product, and I thought that was really cool. It still floats around on the internet, but I think it was sort of this creative offshoot of kind of this girl boss era, which has its fair criticisms, to be fair. But I really enjoyed this idea because it really put the emphasis on you should do stuff because it makes your creative process more enjoyable. It kind of reminds me of, like I said, taking the scenic route. Like, yes, you could get across town faster if you took the highway, but adding on 5 minutes and taking the scenic route because you enjoy the experience more is ultimately more important. And so if you are someone who gets questions like, you know, why do you work on this big elaborate underpainting if you're just going to paint over it, and you know the utility of it, also know that it's okay to simply say, because I like it. And I would encourage you to feel more confident in doing things simply because they're interesting. If it is, for example, weirdly, an important part of your process that you paint some elaborate portrait only to paint an abstract blobby thing on top of it and just have the portrait barely peeking out, then that's what's important. There's an artist who I think in the last couple of years has gone viral because she will do these really ornate oil paintings. Oil takes a long time to cure, and then she will rub her hands through it. And what I really like about that, I almost think of it more as a performance piece because of that, is that people who don't especially make artwork or have a creative outlet in that capacity will often sort of bristle or judge or, you know, remark. It's not a bad thing. You just anticipate comments about it. And I think it's a really interesting point that the most important thing about these processes are just that it's enjoyable for you and that nothing should be precious, and that a big part of having a creative practice is simply having that practice. A lot of times there's a big emotional reaction to this, or to wasting time or doing something that's just going to be covered up or destroying hard work, is I think because at the end of the day we live in a society that really prioritizes consumerism and product over anything else. And I do think it's a very reclaiming of your humanity to push back against that and not have every decision you make go towards the finished product. Certainly it's part of growing. In the very beginning, it was wildly important to me to make a painting that looked like a thing. It was just part of my learning process. So there's no right or wrong way to do anything. But as I've matured into my career, I more and more increasingly favor my own pleasure and experience. And sometimes I like to think that that might show up in the finished work, but by deprioritizing the finished work, it's really given me something very special in my practice. And it is that sort of idea and essence that I'm trying to implore onto you all today in this video. So thank you for listening to that little ramble. If you made it that far, let me know what you think about this video and underpainting in general. And if you have a preferred thing that you like to paint on, I know some people will do collages under it, and you know, people are so wildly creative. So I'm sure there's lots of really cool options and ideas floating around out there. So thank you again for watching. Take care, happy painting, and I'll see you next week.